A millionaire forced his son to marry a humble truck driver to humiliate him. However, he was left speechless by what his son did. The silence in Howard Lancaster's mahogany-paneled office was broken only by the steady tick of his grandfather's Swiss clock and the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 40 floors below, behind his imposing desk. Howard sat motionless, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the stack of papers his private investigator had just delivered. Each page represented another nail in his son's coffin of irresponsibility. $2 million, Howard muttered, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent building an empire, gone in a single night. The investigator, a thin man named Marcus Webb, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The gambling debts are extensive. Mr. Lancaster, and the people he owes, they're not the kind who accept payment plans. Howard's jaw tightened. 28 years of providing for Ethan, 28 years of opportunities handed on a silver platter, and this was what he had to show for it. His only heir had become everything he despised, weak, entitled, and utterly without purpose. "What about the other matter?" Howard asked, not looking up from the papers. "Already handled," Webb replied quickly. "The debts have been settled. Quietly, your family name won't be associated with any unpleasantness." Of course, Howard had paid off the gangsters, not out of paternal love, but because the Lancaster name was worth more than his son's life. Bad publicity could cost him hundreds of millions in government contracts. Howard stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city he'd helped shape through decades of calculated moves and ruthless decisions. Every building in his view represented power, influence, money, and somewhere out there, his son was probably passed out drunk, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. "Mr. Lancaster," Webb ventured, "what would you like me to do about Ethan?" A slow smile spread across Howard's face, the kind that had made corporate rivals nervous for 30 years. He turned back to his desk and pressed the intercom button. "Derek, come in here." Derek Sullivan entered the office with the confidence of a man who'd worked for Howard Lancaster for 5 years. Unlike Webb, Derek understood that Howard's requests often involved creative solutions. "Derek, I need you to find me someone," Howard said, settling back into his leather chair. "A woman. Someone Ethan would consider beneath him. Someone who represents everything we Lancaster men supposedly stand above." Derek raised an eyebrow, but didn't question the request. In his line of work, questions were expensive luxuries. "What kind of woman are we talking about, sir? Working class, rough around the edges, the kind of person who actually works for a living?" Howard's voice dripped with disdain. "I want Ethan to learn what real value looks like, and I want him to learn it the hard way." As Derek left to begin his search, Howard turned his attention back to the city sprawling beneath him. His son needed a lesson in humility, and Howard Lancaster had never been one to teach gently. 300 miles away, Grace Walker downshifted her 18-wheeler as she approached the way station outside of Richmond, Virginia. The morning sun caught the chrome of her Peterbilt's grill, but Grace barely noticed the beauty of the sunrise. Her mind was occupied with more pressing concerns: the stack of medical bills in her glove compartment and the phone call she'd received from Thomas's doctor the night before. "The surgery can't wait much longer, Grace," Dr. Martinez had said, his voice gentle but firm. "Thomas's heart is deteriorating faster than we anticipated." Grace's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel. $50,000. That's what the surgery would cost. And that was just the beginning. The medications, the recovery time, the follow-up procedures. It all added up to a mountain of debt that might as well have been Mount Everest for someone living paycheck to paycheck. She pulled into the truck stop and killed the engine, the sudden silence feeling oppressive after 11 hours of road noise. Through her side mirror, she caught sight of her reflection. 25 years old but looking older. Dark circles under brown eyes that had once sparkled with dreams of becoming a lawyer. Those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who watched Thomas while Grace was on the road. "Tommy had a good day at school. Homework done. He asked when you're coming home." Grace closed her eyes and leaned back against the worn seat. 3 years ago, she'd been studying for the bar exam. Top of her class at the state university. 3 years ago, she'd believed the American dream was within reach if you just worked hard enough. Then came the phone call that changed everything. A drunk driver had run a red light, and in an instant, her parents were gone. The insurance settlement had barely covered the funeral costs. Between Thomas's medical expenses and basic survival, Grace had been forced to drop out of law school and find work that paid immediately. Truck driving wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough to keep them afloat. Barely. She climbed down from the cab and stretched, feeling every mile of the last 3 days in her aching back. The truck stop was busy with the usual mix of long-haul drivers grabbing coffee and quick meals before hitting the road again. Grace had become part of this nomadic community by necessity, not choice, but she'd earned their respect through sheer determination and an unwillingness to be intimidated by anyone. Grace? Hey, Grace. She turned to see Jimmy Martinez waving from beside his rig. Jimmy was one of the good ones, a family man from Texas who'd taken Grace under his wing when she first started driving. "How's the kid doing?" Jimmy asked as he approached. Grace managed a smile. "Hanging in there, you know, Thomas. Tougher than he looks." Jimmy's expression grew serious. "I heard about the surgery, if you need anything." "Thanks, Jimmy, really. But we'll figure it out." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. How many times had she said that in the past year? How many nights had she lain awake doing math that never added up to enough? As Jimmy walked away, Grace pulled out her phone and scrolled through job postings, desperately looking for something that paid more than her current roots. Legal assistant positions caught her eye. Jobs she was overqualified for but couldn't take, because they required her to be in an office. Not on the road earning the money that kept Thomas's medications coming. She was so absorbed in her search that she almost missed the call from an unknown number. Grace Walker. "Yes. My name is Derek Sullivan. I represent a business opportunity that might interest you. Would you be available to meet this afternoon?" Grace frowned. "What kind of business opportunity?" "The kind that could solve your financial problems permanently." "Are you familiar with the Lancaster Transportation Group?" Grace's heart skipped. Everyone in the trucking business knew Lancaster Transportation. They were the biggest logistics company in the country. What would Lancaster want with an independent driver like me? That's what I'd like to discuss in person. There's a diner off I-95, exit 127, Miller's Family Restaurant. Can you be there at 3? Grace checked her watch. She could make the delivery and still get there by 3, but this felt strange. Companies like Lancaster didn't typically seek out small operators unless something was very wrong or very right. "I'll be there," she said finally. As she hung up, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change dramatically. She just didn't know if it would be for better or worse. The morning sun climbed higher as Grace prepared for what might be the most important meeting of her life. Unaware that 300 miles away, Howard Lancaster was putting the finishing touches on a plan that would entangle their fates in ways neither of them could imagine. Miller's Family Restaurant looked exactly like what it was. A tired truck stop diner that had seen better decades. The vinyl booths were cracked. The coffee was strong enough to dissolve steel, and the waitresses called everyone honey, whether they meant it or not. Grace arrived 15 minutes early, nursing a cup of black coffee and watching the parking lot through grease-stained windows. When Derek Sullivan walked through the door at exactly 3 o'clock, he stood out like a custom suit in a thrift store, mid-40s, perfectly groomed, with the kind of expensive haircut that cost more than most people made in a week. His eyes swept the diner until they found Grace, and she saw something flicker across his face. Recognition. Surprise. She couldn't tell. "Ms. Walker." He slid into the booth across from her, placing a leather briefcase on the cracked Formica table. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice. You said this was about Lancaster Transportation. I have to admit, I'm curious." Grace kept her voice steady, professional. Years of dealing with dispatch managers and loading dock supervisors had taught her to project confidence even when she felt out of her depth. Derek opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "What I'm about to propose will sound unconventional. I need you to hear me out completely before you respond." Grace's internal alarm bells started ringing. In her experience, when someone led with a disclaimer like that, whatever came next was either illegal, immoral, or both. "I'm listening. My employer has a son, 28 years old. He's troubled. Gambling debts, alcohol issues, general irresponsibility. My employer believes his son needs to learn the value of hard work and genuine character." "Okay," Grace said slowly. "What does that have to do with me?" Derek leaned forward, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "He wants you to marry him." Grace blinked. For a moment, She was certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "A marriage contract, 5 years in exchange. You would receive $50 million and full medical coverage for any dependents you might have." The coffee cup slipped from Grace's fingers, clattering against the saucer. $50 million. The number was so absurd, so impossibly large, that her brain couldn't process it. She'd been struggling to scrape together $50,000 for Thomas's surgery, and this stranger was casually mentioning a sum that was 1,000 times larger. "This is insane," she whispered. "I understand it's a shock, but think about what that money could mean for your brother." Grace's blood turned to ice. "How do you know about Thomas?" Derek's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "My employer is very thorough when making important decisions. We know about your parents' accident, your brother's medical condition, your financial situation. We know you dropped out of law school and that you work 16-hour days just to keep your heads above water." The violation felt like a physical blow. Some stranger had dissected her life, cataloged her struggles, probably knew things about her that she'd never told anyone. "You had me investigated. We had to be sure you were. Suitable for the arrangement. Suitable for what?" "Exactly. To be some rich kid's charity case. To be humiliated for the entertainment of people who think money makes them better than everyone else." Derek's mask slipped slightly, and for just a moment, Grace caught a glimpse of something that might have been sympathy. The situation isn't ideal for anyone involved, but the compensation would be life-changing. Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "I don't care how much money you're offering, I'm not for sale. Your brother needs surgery." The 4 words hit her like a physical blow, stopping her mid-stride. She turned back to find Derek watching her with those calculating eyes. $50,000 minimum, he continued quietly. "Probably more, given the complexity of his condition. And that's just the surgery, the medications, the follow-up care, the potential complications. How long do you think you can keep working 16-hour days to pay for treatments that only get more expensive?" Grace sank back into the booth, her legs suddenly unsteady. Derek was right, and they both knew it. Thomas's condition was deteriorating, and every day she delayed the surgery was another day closer to losing him. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You represent certain qualities that my employer wants his son to be exposed to. Hard work, determination, resilience. He believes that associating with someone from your background might teach his son valuable lessons." The euphemisms made Grace's stomach churn. She wasn't being recruited for her qualities. She was being hired as a living, breathing object lesson in what happened to people who weren't born into wealth. "And what about your employer's son? Does he know about this arrangement?" "Ethan will be told that he must marry you as a condition of maintaining his inheritance. He won't know about the financial arrangement or the limited duration of the contract. So he'll think I'm just some gold digger who agreed to marry him for money." "That's one possible interpretation." Grace closed her eyes, fighting back tears of rage and humiliation. They wanted to turn her into a living lesson plan, a cautionary tale wrapped in wedding dress. For 5 years, she would be a symbol of everything these people thought was wrong with the world. But Thomas, sweet, brilliant Thomas, who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Thomas, who trusted her to take care of him the way their parents would have wanted. "The medical coverage," she said finally. "It would be immediate. Within 24 hours of the ceremony." Grace opened her eyes and stared at Derek's impassive face. "And after 5 years, you would be free to go with your $50 million. Clean divorce, no strings attached. I want it in writing, every detail, and I want my own lawyer to review the contract." Derek nodded and pulled a business card from his jacket. "My employer expected you might want legal representation. This firm has been retained to represent your interests. They're expecting your call." Grace took the card with trembling fingers. The law firm's name was embossed in gold lettering, the kind of place that charged $1,000 just to schedule a consultation. "There's one more thing," Derek said, closing his briefcase. "The wedding would need to take place within 2 weeks. My employer is eager to begin his son's education. 2 weeks, 14 days to convince herself that she was making the right choice. Not just the only choice. 14 days to prepare to become someone else entirely. I need time to think." "Of course, but Mrs. Walker," Derek paused at the edge of the booth. "I should mention that my employer is not a patient man. This offer won't remain open indefinitely. After he left, Grace sat alone in the diner, staring at the business card as the sun set through the dirty windows. Around her, truck drivers came and went, living their simple, honest lives, unaware that the young woman in booth 7 was contemplating a decision that would change everything. She thought about Thomas in his hospital bed, trying to be brave while his 12-year-old heart struggled with each beat. She thought about her parents, who had sacrificed everything to give their children better lives. She thought about the law degree gathering dust in a box, the dreams she'd already sacrificed for family. When Grace finally left the diner 3 hours later, she knew what she had to do. She just wasn't sure she could live with herself afterward. The choice between dignity and desperation wasn't really a choice at all. The Lancaster mansion rose from its manicured grounds like a monument to old money and older grudges. Grace stood at the foot of the marble steps, her single duffel bag feeling pathetically small in her hands as she stared up at the imposing Georgian facade. 2 weeks had passed since that meeting in the diner. 2 weeks of lawyers, contracts, and sleepless nights. Now here she was, officially Mrs. Ethan Lancaster, feeling like an imposter in her own life. The wedding had been exactly what she'd expected. A cold, sterile ceremony in Howard's private office with a judge who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Ethan had barely looked at her during the 10-minute proceeding. His jaw clenched so tight she thought it might crack. He'd mumbled his vows like a death sentence and signed the certificate with the enthusiasm of someone signing his own execution warrant. "You coming in? Or are you planning to live on the porch?" Grace turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, still wearing the expensive suit from their wedding 3 hours ago. His dark hair was disheveled, and she could smell the whiskey from 6 feet away. His blue eyes, which might have been attractive under different circumstances, were cold as winter steel. Grace started, then stopped. Just what? Admiring the prison where she'd spend the next 5 years. "Look, let's get something straight right off the bat," Ethan said, stepping aside so she could enter. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing with my father, but this arrangement, it's not real. You're here for his money, and I'm here because I apparently don't have a choice anymore. So let's just stay out of each other's way." The foyer was all marble and crystal, with a sweeping staircase that belonged in a museum. Grace had grown up in a 3-bedroom ranch house where her father fixed the leaky faucets himself and her mother clipped coupons every Sunday. This felt like stepping into another world entirely. "Your room is upstairs, 3rd door on the right," Ethan continued, already heading toward what looked like a study. "I'll be staying in the guest wing. We won't be playing house." "Fine by me," Grace replied, matching his cold tone. She wasn't about to let him see how much his dismissal stung. Ethan paused at the study door, his hand on the brass handle. "And another thing, don't think this little performance of yours is going to earn you any sympathy points. I know exactly what you are." "And what's that?" He turned back with a smile that had no warmth in it. "A smart girl who knows a golden opportunity when she sees one. Just don't expect me to pretend to like it." The door slammed behind him, with enough force to rattle the crystal chandelier. Grace stood alone in the vast foyer, surrounded by luxury that felt like a beautiful cage. She climbed the stairs slowly, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The 3rd door on the right opened to reveal a bedroom that was larger than the entire apartment she'd shared with Thomas. The 4-poster bed could have slept 6 people, and the walk-in closet was bigger than most studio apartments. She dropped her duffel bag on the pristine white comforter and sank into a chair by the window. From here, she could see the garden stretching toward the tree line, perfectly manicured and utterly lifeless. It was beautiful in the way a photograph was beautiful. All surface, no soul. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Tommy's surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. He's excited about the fancy new hospital, says it looks like a castle." Grace closed her eyes, reminding herself why she was here. Thomas was getting the best cardiac surgeon in the country, in a facility that specialized in pediatric heart conditions. Whatever she had to endure, it was worth it for that. Over the following weeks, Grace established a routine that kept her sane and away from Ethan as much as possible. She was up by 4 a.m., a habit from her trucking days that she couldn't shake, while the rest of the house slept. She'd make coffee in the industrial-sized kitchen and study for the bar exam using books she'd ordered online. She was determined not to waste these 5 years completely. By 6 a.m., she was in the mansion's gym, a facility that put most commercial gyms to shame. Physical exercise helped burn off the frustration and anxiety that threatened to consume her. By 8 a.m., she was showered and ready to face whatever indignities the day might bring. The household staff treated her with polite confusion. They'd clearly been told she was the new Mrs. Lancaster, but her obvious discomfort with the luxury and her insistence on doing things herself baffled them. Grace made her own bed, did her own laundry, and refused to let anyone wait on her hand and foot. "Ma'am, please," Maria, the head housekeeper, pleaded one morning as Grace insisted on cleaning up her own breakfast dishes. "Mr. Howard will be upset if he thinks we're not taking proper care of you." "Mr. Howard can worry about his own problems," Grace replied, scrubbing her coffee mug with perhaps more force than necessary. "I've been taking care of myself for 25 years. I'm not stopping now." Ethan, meanwhile, seemed determined to prove every negative stereotype about rich kids. He slept until noon, spent his afternoons drinking in his study, and his evenings either gambling online or stumbling home from whatever club would still let him through the door. Grace caught glimpses of him in the hallways sometimes, always looking like he hadn't slept, always smelling like expensive liquor and poor choices. The few times they were forced to interact were exercises in mutual hostility. "Nice outfit," he commented one evening, as Grace headed to the kitchen for dinner. She was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, her usual attire, really embracing the whole lady of the manor thing. "Aren't you?" "Sorry to disappoint," Grace replied evenly. "I left my tiara in my other life." "Right, the life where you drove trucks for a living. Very aspirational." Grace stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "You know what? You're right. I did drive trucks, 16 hours a day, sometimes more. I've loaded and unloaded cargo in 100-degree heat and below zero cold. I've fixed broken-down rigs on the side of highways while men twice my size told me I didn't belong there. And you know what I learned from all that?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting her to fight back. "I learned that honest work never killed anyone. But apparently, having everything handed to you on a silver platter might, judging by how well that's working out for you." She turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing in the hallway with his mouth slightly open. But the worst part wasn't Ethan's hostility. It was the loneliness. Grace had never felt more isolated in her life. She couldn't confide in Mrs. Rodriguez without revealing details of her arrangement that would sound insane. She couldn't complain to Thomas, who was recovering beautifully from his surgery, and thought his sister had simply married a nice man with good insurance. She couldn't even vent to the household staff, who viewed her as both their employer and a complete enigma. The nights were the hardest. Lying in a bed that cost more than most cars, staring at a ceiling painted with cherubs and gold leaf, Grace felt like she was disappearing piece by piece. She'd traded her identity for her brother's life, and some days she wasn't sure she'd made the right choice. 3 months into the marriage, Grace was coming back from her evening run when she heard sounds coming from Ethan's study. Not the usual jazz music or sports commentary, but something that sounded like distress. She paused outside the door, torn between her instinct to help and her determination to maintain their mutual isolation. The sound came again. Definitely someone in pain. Despite every rational thought telling her to keep walking, Grace knocked on the door. "Ethan, are you okay?" No answer, but the sounds of distress continued. Grace tried the handle and found the door unlocked. Inside, she found Ethan curled up in his leather chair, hyperventilating and shaking like a leaf. His face was pale and covered in sweat, and his eyes had the wild look of someone drowning. For a moment, Grace forgot about their hostility, their forced marriage, everything except the fact that another human being was suffering. "Hey," she said softly, approaching slowly like she might approach a wounded animal. "It's okay. You're having a panic attack. It's going to pass. Don't look at me like that." Ethan gasped between ragged breaths, his hands clutching the arms of the leather chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Despite the cool evening air flowing through the open window, Grace ignored his protest and moved closer, her voice calm and steady. "Like what?" "Like I'm some kind of pathetic." He couldn't finish the sentence, his breathing becoming more erratic. "You're not pathetic," Grace said simply, settling into the chair across from him. "You're having a panic attack. I've had them too." Ethan's wild eyes focused on her for a moment, surprise breaking through the terror. You. After my parents died, the first few months were rough. Grace kept her voice low and even, remembering how her own panic attacks had felt like drowning in thin air. The trick is to focus on something you can control. Your breathing. I can't breathe. Yes, you can. You're talking to me, which means air is getting in and out, Grace demonstrated, taking a slow, deliberate breath. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Don't think about anything else, just the counting. For a moment, Ethan just stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. Then slowly, he began to follow her lead. His breathing was still ragged, but the desperate edge began to fade. That's it, Grace encouraged. One breath at a time. They sat in silence for several minutes, Grace maintaining the steady breathing pattern while Ethan gradually regained control. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the seconds, and somewhere in the distance, Grace could hear the hum of the mansion's central air system. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan asked finally, his voice hoarse but steadier. Grace considered the question. Why was she helping him? 3 months of cold hostility and mutual avoidance should have made her walk away, let him deal with his demons alone. But sitting here, seeing him stripped of all his arrogant defenses, she saw something she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. "Because you needed help," she said simply. "And I was here." Ethan's laugh was bitter. "Right. The perfect wife swooping in to save the day. My father must be thrilled with his choice." "This has nothing to do with your father." Grace's voice sharpened slightly. "I didn't help you because I'm playing some role. I helped you because you were drowning, and I know what that feels like." Something in her tone must have gotten through to him, because Ethan's defensive posture softened slightly. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Sorry," he mumbled. I'm not great at accepting help." I noticed. They fell into another silence, but this one felt different, less hostile, more cautious, like 2 wounded animals deciding whether the other was a threat. "What triggered it?" Grace asked gently. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I was trying to stay away from the poker sites. Made it 3 days." He gestured toward his computer, where Grace could see an online casino login page still glowing on the screen. "But tonight I needed something, anything, to make the noise in my head stop." Grace nodded. She understood addiction, even if her own demons were different. "How long have you been gambling?" "Since college, started small, just betting on games with my roommates, but it escalated." Ethan's voice was flat, emotionless. "By graduation, I was in debt up to my eyeballs. Dad paid it off, gave me a lecture about responsibility, and I promised to quit. But you didn't. I tried. God, I tried so many times, but every time I thought I had it beat, something would happen. A bad day, a rejection, boredom, and I'd tell myself just one hand, just one bet." He looked at Grace with something that might have been shame. "I bet $2 million on a single hand of poker 3 months ago. $2 million. Do you know how insane that is?" Grace thought about the $50,000 she'd struggled to raise for Thomas's surgery. Money that would have been life-changing for her family. $2 million was a sum so large it almost felt abstract. "Is that why your father arranged this marriage? As punishment?" Ethan's laugh was harsh. "Punishment? Lesson? Humiliation? Take your pick. Howard Lancaster doesn't do anything without multiple motivations." He studied Grace's face. "Though I have to admit, you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone more obvious. Someone who'd bat her eyelashes and call me honey and pretend to be thrilled about landing a rich husband." Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. "You act like being here is the last thing you want to do." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't exactly explain that it was the last thing she wanted to do, that she was only here because her brother needed surgery, and $50 million was too much to turn down. "Maybe that's because your father made it clear this arrangement isn't exactly a love match," she said carefully. "True enough." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then looked at her with genuine curiosity. "Can I ask you something? And will you give me an honest answer?" Grace tensed. "Depends on the question. Why did you really agree to marry me? And don't give me some line about being swept off your feet by my charm and good looks." The question hung in the air between them like a live wire. Grace could feel the weight of her secrets pressing against her chest. She thought about Thomas, about Derek Sullivan, about the investigation into her family that had led to this moment. How much truth could she afford to tell? "I needed the money," she said finally. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't exactly a lie either. Ethan nodded slowly. "For your brother's medical bills." Grace's head snapped up. "How do you know about Thomas?" "My father's investigators are thorough. I saw the report." Ethan's expression was unreadable. "Congenital heart defect, needed surgery you couldn't afford. The insurance from your trucking job wouldn't cover the specialist you needed." Grace felt exposed, violated all over again. "So, you know everything about me. I know the facts, but I'm starting to realize that's not the same thing as knowing you." Ethan was studying her with those blue eyes that seemed clearer now, less clouded by alcohol and self-pity. "For instance, the report said you were a truck driver, but it didn't mention that you were in law school before that. How did you—" "I saw the bar exam prep books in your room. The door was open when Maria was cleaning." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Why law?" Grace hesitated. This felt dangerous, like opening a door she wasn't sure she could close again. But something about Ethan's tone, the absence of his usual mockery, made her want to answer honestly. "My father was a paralegal," she said slowly. "He used to say that the law was the one place where being right mattered more than being rich or well-connected. I wanted to believe that was true. And now I think my father was a romantic." Grace's smile was sad. The law is just another system, and like all systems, it works better for some people than others. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. "You sound like you speak from experience." Grace thought about her parents' accident, about the drunk driver who'd gotten a slap on the wrist because his father was a city councilman, about the insurance company that had fought every claim. "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "About your parents. The report mentioned the accident, but not, 'I'm sorry.'" The simple words, spoken without his usual defensive sarcasm, hit Grace harder than she'd expected. She'd grown so used to his hostility that this glimpse of genuine empathy caught her off guard. "Thank you," she managed. They sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened outside the study windows. For the first time since their wedding, Grace felt like she was talking to a real person instead of a caricature of privilege and entitlement. "Grace," Ethan's voice was hesitant, "what you did tonight, staying with me through that attack. I haven't had anyone do that in a long time." "Everyone deserves help when they're drowning," Grace replied, "even if they're drowning in their own choices." Ethan winced slightly at the gentle barb, but he didn't argue. "Fair enough, but still, thank you." As Grace made her way back to her room that night, she realized something had shifted between them. The wall of mutual hostility hadn't crumbled, but there was definitely a crack in it now. And through that crack, she'd caught a glimpse of who Ethan Lancaster might be, underneath all the anger and self-destruction. It was a dangerous realization. Getting emotionally involved with him wasn't part of the plan. Not Derek's plan, not her plan, not anyone's plan. But as she lay in her enormous bed, staring at the cherub-painted ceiling, Grace couldn't shake the image of Ethan's face when he'd thanked her. For the first time since arriving at the Lancaster mansion, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. The morning after Ethan's panic attack, Grace woke to find a note slipped under her door, written in surprisingly neat handwriting. It simply said, "Thank you, E." She stared at the piece of paper for a long moment, wondering if this was some kind of truce, or just polite acknowledgement of her help. Over the following days, she got her answer. Ethan still kept his distance, but the sharp edge of hostility had dulled. He nodded when they passed in the hallways. He said, "Good morning," when they encountered each other in the kitchen. Small gestures, but after months of open warfare, they felt significant. 2 weeks later, Grace was in the study early one morning, surrounded by law books and legal pads covered in notes, when Ethan appeared in the doorway. He looked better than he had in months. Cleaner, more alert, like someone who'd actually slept. "Sorry," he said, starting to back away. "I didn't know you were using the room." "It's fine," Grace replied, not looking up from her notes. "I can move if you need the space." "No, what are you studying?" Grace glanced up to find him genuinely curious, not mocking. Constitutional law, working my way through the bar exam prep. Ethan stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the organized chaos of her study materials. That's a lot of books. 5 years worth of material to catch up on, Grace said simply. I figure I might as well use this time for something productive. Right, the law school thing. Ethan hesitated at the edge of her makeshift study area. Can I ask you something? Why didn't you just go back to school after you got married? I mean, money's not exactly an issue anymore. Grace set down her pen and really looked at him. Because taking your father's money to pay for law school would feel like accepting charity. This way, I'm earning it myself, even if it takes longer. Especially if it takes longer. Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing her response. That's actually pretty admirable. Don't sound so surprised, Grace said dryly, but there was no real bite in it. Sorry, it's just, most people I know would have jumped at the chance for a free ride. I'm not most people you know. No, Ethan agreed, settling into a nearby chair. You're really not. They fell into a companionable silence, Grace returning to her notes while Ethan sat lost in thought. It was the most peaceful interaction they'd had since their wedding day. Grace, Ethan's voice was hesitant. I've been thinking about what you said, about honest work. Grace looked up, surprised by the serious tone. I know you think I'm just some spoiled rich kid who's never worked a day in his life, Ethan continued. And you're not wrong, but I've been wondering, what if I wanted to change that? What if I wanted to learn what honest work actually looks like? What are you asking, Ethan? I'm asking if you'd teach me. Grace blinked, certain she'd misheard. Teach you what? Whatever you're willing to teach. How to actually work. How to, I don't know, how to be useful. Ethan's words came out in a rush, like he was afraid he'd lose his nerve. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm tired of being the person I've been. Maybe it's time to try being someone else. Grace studied his face, looking for signs of mockery or manipulation, but his expression was earnest, almost vulnerable. You're serious. Dead serious. Ethan, I'm not sure what you think I can teach you. I drove trucks and loaded cargo. That's not exactly... It's more than I've ever done, Ethan interrupted. And from what I saw in that investigator's report, you built something with that work. You supported yourself and your brother. You earned people's respect. That's more than I can say for myself. Grace felt something shift in her chest. A dangerous warmth that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with hope. What about your father? He's not going to be thrilled if his son starts doing manual labor. Let me worry about my father. The determination in Ethan's voice surprised her. For the first time since she'd known him, he sounded like a man instead of a petulant child. Okay, Grace said slowly. But if we're going to do this, we do it right. No special treatment, no quitting when it gets hard. If you want to learn about honest work, you're going to learn about all of it, including the parts that suck. Ethan's smile was the first genuine one she'd seen from him. Deal. Grace's first lesson came sooner than expected. 3 days later, she received a call from Jimmy Martinez asking if she could help with an emergency run to Florida. A regular driver had called in sick, and they needed someone reliable to handle a time-sensitive delivery. I thought you were out of the trucking business, Jimmy said over the phone. I am, but I still have my CDL and I miss it sometimes. Grace glanced toward the study where Ethan was reading, having apparently taken her seriously about the learning process. Actually, I might have a passenger for this trip, someone who wants to see what the job is really like. You sure about that? It's not exactly a luxury cruise. Trust me, that's exactly the point. When Grace told Ethan about the trip, his enthusiasm didn't waver. Even when she explained it would mean 2 days on the road, sleeping in truck stops, and eating gas station food. When do we leave? Was all he asked, the next morning. Grace led Ethan to the garage where she'd had her personal rig delivered, a modest but well-maintained Kenworth that looked tiny next to the luxury cars filling the Lancaster garage. Ethan stared at the 18-wheeler like it was an alien spacecraft. This is what you drove for 3 years. Every day. Grace ran her hand along the truck's side with obvious affection. This old girl has been from California to Maine and back again. She's reliable, efficient, and she doesn't judge you for your past mistakes. Unlike people. Unlike some people, Grace corrected gently. The first few hours on the road were awkward. Ethan sat in the passenger seat like he was afraid to touch anything. asking endless questions about the controls, the route, the cargo they were hauling. But as the miles rolled by and Grace patiently explained the intricacies of long-haul trucking, he began to relax. "It's more complicated than I thought," he admitted as Grace navigated through heavy traffic outside Atlanta. "Most people think you just point the truck down the highway and go," Grace replied, adjusting her mirrors as a car cut too close in front of them. "But you're responsible for 80,000 pounds of vehicle and cargo, plus whatever traffic is around you. Every decision matters." "Like what?" "Like that idiot who just cut us off. In a regular car, you hit the brakes and move on. In a loaded truck, you have to think about stopping distance, weight distribution, what's behind you, whether the car next to you is going to panic and do something stupid." Grace's voice was calm. "Professional. One wrong move and you can kill someone." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of that responsibility. "How do you handle the pressure?" "You respect the machine and the job. You stay alert, you follow the rules, and you never forget that getting home safe is more important than getting there fast." Around noon, Grace pulled into a truck stop for fuel and food. Ethan watched in fascination as she efficiently checked the tires, inspected the load securement, and completed her logbook entries. "Want to try backing into that parking spot?" Grace asked, gesturing toward a tight space between two other trucks. Ethan's eyes widened. "Are you insane? I'll hit something." "Not if you listen and follow directions, come on." What followed was 20 minutes of the most nerve-wracking instruction Grace had ever given. Ethan's first attempt ended with the trailer at a 45-degree angle to the truck. His second attempt was worse, but gradually, with Grace's patient coaching, he began to understand the physics of maneuvering a vehicle that long. "Slower," Grace called out as Ethan tried his fifth approach. "Remember, the trailer goes the opposite direction of where you turn the wheel when you're backing up." "This is impossible," Ethan muttered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "No, it's just different from anything you've done before. Try again." On his 8th attempt, Ethan successfully backed the truck into the parking space. The alignment wasn't perfect, but it was serviceable. When he climbed down from the driver's seat, his hands were shaking slightly, but his face was flushed with accomplishment. "I can't believe I just did that," he said, staring at the properly parked truck. "Believe it," Grace replied, and that was just the easy part. That night, they stopped at a modest motel off Interstate 75. Ethan insisted on paying for separate rooms, but Grace noticed he didn't complain about the basic accommodations or the fact that the ice machine was broken and the Wi-Fi barely worked. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in the other truckers they encountered, asking questions about their roots, their families, their reasons for choosing life on the road. "You're different out here," Grace observed as they sat in the motel's small restaurant, sharing a meal that was heavy on calories and light on gourmet touches. "Different how?" "Less angry, more present." Grace pushed her French fries around on her plate. "It's like you're actually interested in the world instead of just enduring it." Ethan considered this. "Maybe I am. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm doing something real, something that matters. Driving a truck matters, learning does, growing does." Ethan met her eyes across the small table. "Having someone believe I'm capable of more than just screwing up matters." The sincerity in his voice caught Grace off guard. She'd entered this arrangement expecting to deal with a spoiled rich kid who would eventually show his true colors. She hadn't expected to find someone genuinely trying to change, someone willing to put in the hard work of becoming a better person. It was dangerous territory, caring about Ethan Lancaster as a person, rather than just tolerating him as an obligation. But as Grace lay in her motel bed that night, listening to the hum of highway traffic through thin walls, she realized she might already be too late to protect her heart. The next morning would bring new challenges. But for the first time since her wedding day, Grace fell asleep feeling something that might have been hope. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but Grace began to notice the changes in Ethan within weeks of their return from Florida. He was up earlier, cleaner, more focused. The bottles of expensive whiskey that had once lined his study remained unopened. The online gambling sites stayed closed on his computer. Most remarkably, he seemed genuinely interested in learning everything Grace was willing to teach him. "Show me the books," he said one morning. finding Grace in the study going through a stack of invoices and delivery confirmations she'd brought from her storage unit. What books? The business side. I know you weren't just driving for other people the whole time. Jimmy mentioned you had your own operation toward the end. Grace looked up from the paperwork, surprised. You talked to Jimmy? I called him yesterday. Asked if he had any loads that needed an extra hand. Ethan's expression was sheepish but determined. He said he might have something next week, but I should probably learn how to do more than just back up a truck first. Despite herself, Grace smiled. And what exactly did you tell him you could do? Nothing yet, but I'm hoping you'll teach me. Grace gestured to the paperwork spread across the desk. This is the unglamorous part. Invoicing, route planning, fuel cost calculations, maintenance schedules. It's not exactly exciting. Neither is bankruptcy, Ethan replied, settling into the chair across from her, which is apparently where my current skill set leads over the following hours. Grace walked Ethan through the basic economics of independent trucking. He was surprisingly quick to grasp the concepts: fuel efficiency, load-to-mile ratios, the delicate balance between maximizing revenue and minimizing expenses. So if you take a load from Atlanta to Denver for $2 per mile, but you have to deadhead back empty, you're really only making $1 per mile on the round trip, Ethan said, working through one of Grace's examples. Exactly. That's why load planning is so critical. The best drivers are constantly thinking 3 or 4 loads ahead, trying to create circuits that minimize empty miles. It's like logistics, Ethan mused. Actually, it's exactly like logistics, just on a smaller scale than what my father's company does. Grace paused, her pen hovering over a delivery receipt. You know about logistics. I have an MBA from Wharton. Operations management was actually one of my stronger subjects. Ethan's voice carried a note of self-deprecation. Turns out knowing how to optimize supply chains doesn't help much when you're too drunk or high on adrenaline from gambling to apply the knowledge, but you could apply it now. Maybe. If someone was willing to trust me with real responsibility. Grace studied his face, seeing something she'd never noticed before. Intelligence. Not just cleverness or education, but genuine analytical thinking. What if we started small? I still have my operating authority, my dot numbers. What if we took on a few loads together, see how it goes? Ethan's eyes lit up. You'd be willing to do that, even though you don't have to work anymore. I miss it, Grace admitted. And maybe it's time to see if we can build something together instead of just enduring each other. Their first joint venture was a simple run from Richmond to Jacksonville, a route Grace knew well with a reliable customer. Ethan approached it with the intensity of someone studying for finals, researching fuel stops, alternative routes, and weather conditions along the way. You know you're overthinking this, right? Grace said as they prepared to leave, watching Ethan double-check their route for the 3rd time. Maybe, but I'd rather overthink it than screw it up. The trip went smoothly, but what impressed Grace most wasn't Ethan's growing competence behind the wheel. It was his attitude toward the work itself. He asked questions constantly, not just about driving techniques, but about the business relationships Grace had built over the years. How long did it take you to get that customer to trust you with their regular runs? He asked as they secured a load of electronics equipment. About 6 months of perfect on-time delivery and 0 damage claims, Grace replied, tightening a strap on the trailer. Trust is everything in this business. Your reputation is your most valuable asset. More valuable than the truck. Much more. Trucks can be replaced. A reputation takes years to build and can be destroyed in a single day. As weeks turned into months, their working relationship evolved into something Grace hadn't expected. Partnership. Ethan's business acumen, combined with Grace's operational experience, created a synergy that surprised them both. They began taking on more complex loads, multi-stop deliveries that required careful coordination and timing. We could probably handle twice this volume if we had a second truck, Ethan said one evening as they reviewed their growing client list. Probably, but that means hiring a driver, taking on debt, expanding faster than we can manage. Or it means growing smart. I've been thinking about this, Grace. We could partner with other independent operators, create a network, offer the reliability and coordination of a larger company, while maintaining the personal service that small operators provide. Grace looked up from her laptop. Intrigued despite herself. Go on. Think about it. Most independents struggle with the business side, finding consistent loads, managing cash flow, dealing with paperwork, but most big companies struggle with flexibility and personal service. We could be the bridge. Over the following weeks, Ethan outlined his vision with the same intensity he'd once brought to gambling. But this time, instead of chasing the high of risk, he was building something sustainable. He researched other successful owner-operator networks, analyzed market gaps, developed financial projections that were both ambitious and realistic. "This could really work," Grace said one night. Reviewing his latest business plan, they were sitting in the study, surrounded by spreadsheets and market analysis reports. "It's actually brilliant. You sound surprised." "I am. 6 months ago, I thought you were just a trust fund kid with no practical skills." 6 months ago, I was a trust fund kid with no practical skills, Ethan replied. "You changed that. You changed that. I just showed you what was already there." Their eyes met across the desk, and Grace felt something shift between them. The careful, professional distance they'd maintained was dissolving, replaced by something warmer and infinitely more dangerous. "Grace," Ethan said softly, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "This. Working with you. Building something together. It's the first time in my life I've felt like I was worth something. Not because of my last name or my father's money, but because of what I could contribute." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. "Ethan, I know this isn't what either of us planned. I know this marriage was supposed to be a business arrangement, but I can't pretend anymore that you're just some convenient teacher or business partner." Ethan's voice was steady, honest. "I'm falling in love with you, Grace. Have been for months." The words hung in the air between them like a live wire. Grace felt the carefully constructed walls around her heart crumbling, revealing feelings she'd been fighting since that night she'd helped him through his panic attack. "This is complicated," she whispered. "I know. Your father can go to hell," Ethan said firmly. "This isn't about him anymore. This is about us." Grace thought about Derek Sullivan, about the real reason she'd agreed to this marriage, about the secrets she was still keeping. But looking at Ethan now, seeing the man he'd become, the partner he'd proven himself to be, those secrets felt like relics from another life. "I love you too," she said quietly. "I didn't want to. I tried not to. But I do." Ethan stood and walked around the desk, taking her hands in his. "So, what do we do now?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I've never been in love with someone I was contractually obligated to marry." Ethan's laugh was soft, genuine. "Well, that makes 2 of us." He leaned down and kissed her then, gentle and tentative at first, then with growing certainty as Grace kissed him back. It was nothing like their cold, formal wedding kiss. This was real, chosen, honest. When they broke apart, Grace rested her forehead against his. "Everything just got a lot more complicated. Or maybe it just got a lot simpler," Ethan replied. "Maybe we stop pretending this is temporary and start building something permanent." "And your father?" "My father wanted to teach me about value," Ethan said, his arms tightening around her. "Mission accomplished. I finally understand what's actually worth fighting for." As they held each other in the study, surrounded by their business plans and shared dreams, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced since before her parents' death. Genuine happiness. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely unexpected. She just hoped it would survive the secrets that were still waiting to surface. Howard Lancaster stood at his office window, watching the city lights flicker to life in the gathering dusk. For 6 months, he'd observed his son's transformation with growing unease. The drinking had stopped. The gambling had ceased. Most disturbing of all, Ethan appeared to be happy. This was not the lesson Howard had intended to teach. The plan had been simple: force Ethan to marry someone beneath their social station. Watch him squirm with embarrassment and resentment, then emerge humbled and grateful for his true place in the world. Instead, his son was working alongside his wife, building some kind of trucking operation. And worst of all, thriving. Howard picked up the phone and dialed Marcus Webb. "I need you to dig deeper into Grace Walker's background," he said without preamble. "Sir, we already provided a comprehensive report. Then it wasn't comprehensive enough. I want to know everything. Where she went to school, who her friends were, what her parents did for a living, where they shopped for groceries, everything. "Of course, Mr. Lancaster. Is there something specific you're looking for?" Howard's reflection stared back at him from the darkened window. A man who had built an empire by finding weaknesses and exploiting them. "There's always something, Webb. Always." 3 days later, Webb sat across from Howard's desk with a much thicker file. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. "Sir, I think you need to see this." Webb slid a photograph across the mahogany surface. It showed a man in his 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, standing next to a woman with Grace's smile. They were posed formally, like a professional headshot. "Richard and Margaret Walker," Webb said quietly. "Grace's parents." Howard glanced at the photo dismissively. "So, Richard Walker was a paralegal with Morrison. Hendricks and Associates 7 years ago, he was working on a case involving corporate fraud and corruption. Specifically, he was building a case against Lancaster Transportation Group." The words hit Howard like a physical blow. His hand stilled halfway to his coffee cup, and for a moment, the only sound in the office was the steady tick of the grandfather clock. "Impossible," Howard breathed. "I'm afraid not, sir. Walker had been investigating irregularities in your government contracts for months. According to the files I was able to access, he had evidence of bid rigging, fraudulent billing, and other activities." Howard's mind raced back 7 years. He remembered Richard Walker now, the persistent paralegal who had been asking too many questions. Making too many inquiries, Howard had dealt with the problem efficiently. As he always did, the car accident had been regrettable but necessary. "The accident," Howard said slowly, "may not have been an accident," Webb confirmed. "Walker was scheduled to meet with federal prosecutors the week after he died. His files were destroyed in a convenient office fire 3 days later." Howard stared at the photograph, his mind spinning. Grace Walker, Richard Walker's daughter, the woman he had specifically chosen to humiliate his son, was the daughter of the man he had ordered killed. "Does she know?" Howard asked. "I believe so, sir. And there's more." Webb slid another document across the desk. It was a driver's license photo of Derek Sullivan, but he looked younger, less polished. Derek Sullivan used to be David Salazar. He was Richard Walker's research assistant. Apparently, he was working late the night of the office fire and barely escaped. He's been building a new identity and a new case against you ever since. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Derek hadn't randomly chosen Grace for this arrangement. He had orchestrated it, somehow. He had manipulated Howard into bringing his greatest enemy directly into his home. "She's been spying on me," Howard said, his voice deadly quiet. "For 6 months she's been living in my house, married to my son, gathering information." "It appears that way, sir." Howard's hands clenched into fists. The careful control he had maintained for decades began to crack. He had been played, manipulated by a truck-driving law school dropout, and a paralegal's assistant who should have died in that fire 7 years ago. "Where is she now?" "At the house, sir. She and Ethan returned from a delivery run about an hour ago." Howard stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward with enough force to hit the credenza behind his desk. "Get the car." Grace was in the kitchen, making coffee and reviewing route schedules for the following week, when she heard the front door slam with enough force to rattle the windows. Heavy footsteps echoed through the foyer, moving with unmistakable purpose toward the kitchen. Howard appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury that made Grace's blood turn to ice. In his hand, he held a manila folder. "Hello, Grace," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Or should I say, hello, Miss Walker, daughter of Richard Walker." Grace's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The hot liquid splashed across her feet, but she barely noticed. Her worst nightmare was standing in the kitchen doorway, and there was nowhere to run. "I see you remember your father," Howard continued, stepping carefully around the broken ceramic. "Brilliant man, very thorough, very persistent, very dead. You killed them," Grace whispered, the words scraping her throat like broken glass. "I solved a problem. Your father was going to destroy everything I had built, ruin thousands of jobs, devastate communities that depended on Lancaster transportation. I did what needed to be done." Grace backed against the kitchen counter, her hands gripping the granite edge so tightly her knuckles went white. "They were good people. They never hurt anyone. They were threats. And now, it seems, so are you. Howard opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. David Salazar, also known as Derek Sullivan, your father's assistant, and, I assume, your current handler. Grace's world tilted sideways. How could Howard know about Derek? How could he know about any of this? 6 months, Howard continued conversationally. 6 months of you living in my house, sleeping in my guest room, playing the loving wife to my son. Very convincing performance, I must admit. Even I was beginning to think you might be genuine. I am genuine, Grace said desperately. Howard, whatever you think this is, what I think this is, Howard interrupted, his voice rising, is an elaborate revenge plot, orchestrated by a dead man's daughter and his surviving accomplice. What I think this is corporate espionage. What I think this is attempted murder of my character and my business. You're wrong. Am I? Howard smiled, and the expression was terrifying. Then explain to me how a simple truck driver just happened to catch my investigator's attention. Explain how she just happened to be perfect for my purposes. Explain the remarkable coincidence that brought Richard Walker's daughter directly into my home. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but no words came, because Howard wasn't wrong. Not entirely. Derek had orchestrated her selection. She had accepted the marriage partially for revenge. She had been gathering information, documenting Howard's activities, building a case. But that was before. Before she'd fallen in love with Ethan. Before she'd discovered that revenge could transform into something else entirely. I thought so, Howard said, reading the truth in her silence. The question now is, what do I do about it? Howard, please, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. You came here to destroy me, and you seduced my son to help you do it. That's not true, Grace found her voice, anger overriding fear. I love Ethan. What we have together is real. Love, Howard laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. You're here under false pretenses, using a false identity, pursuing a false marriage for the purpose of industrial espionage and revenge. What exactly about that is real? Before Grace could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face lighting up when he saw Grace, before confusion clouded his features as he took in the tense scene. What's going on? He asked, looking between his father and his wife. Howard turned to his son with a smile that held no warmth. I was just having a conversation with your wife about her true identity. It seems Mrs. Lancaster has some secrets she's been keeping from you. Grace felt her world crumbling around her. Everything she'd built with Ethan, all the trust and love and partnership they'd developed, was about to be destroyed by the truth she'd been hiding. Grace. Ethan's voice was uncertain, vulnerable. What is he talking about? Grace looked at the man she'd fallen in love with, the man who'd transformed himself through honest work and genuine effort, the man whose trust she was about to shatter. She thought about Derek's plan, about her promise to her parents' memory, about the justice that still needed to be served. Then she thought about Ethan's hands in hers, about the way he'd looked at her when he'd said he loved her, about the future they'd been planning together. Ethan, she said softly, her heart breaking with every word. There's something I need to tell you. The silence in the kitchen stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Ethan's eyes moved between Grace and his father, confusion and growing dread written across his face. Grace felt the weight of 6 months of deception pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Grace. Ethan's voice was softer now, more uncertain. What does he mean, your true identity? Howard stepped forward, still holding the manila folder like a weapon. Allow me to enlighten you, son. Your beloved wife isn't who she claims to be. Her name is Grace Walker, and her father was the man who tried to destroy our family 7 years ago. That's impossible, Ethan said immediately, his loyalty to Grace overriding his confusion. Grace's father was a paralegal who died in a car accident. He was a paralegal, Howard confirmed with cold satisfaction. A paralegal who was building a federal case against Lancaster Transportation. A paralegal who had to be stopped. The implication hit Ethan like a physical blow. His face went pale as he looked at his father with dawning horror. Dad, what are you saying? I'm saying that your wife's parents didn't die in an accident. Ethan, They died because they were threatening everything we've built. Grace found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. He murdered them, Ethan. Your father had my parents killed. The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Ethan stood frozen, his world reshaping itself around this new, terrible reality. You're lying, he said finally, but there was no conviction in his voice. Howard opened the folder and spread photographs across the granite countertop. Crime scene photos, newspaper clippings, official reports. The evidence speaks for itself. Richard Walker was getting too close to information that could have brought down our entire operation. I did what was necessary to protect our family. Grace watched Ethan's face as he processed his father's casual admission of murder. She saw the exact moment when denial became acceptance, when the son she'd fallen in love with realized what his father truly was. Jesus Christ. Ethan breathed, staggering backward until he hit the kitchen island. You actually did it. You actually had them killed. I protected us, Howard said firmly. Just like I'll protect us from this little revenge plot. Ethan's eyes snapped to Grace, and she saw the betrayal there. Raw, devastating, complete, revenge plot. Grace opened her mouth to explain, but Howard beat her to it. Your wife didn't accidentally catch our investigator's attention, son. She was specifically chosen for this arrangement by Derek Sullivan, who used to be David Salazar, Richard Walker's research assistant, the same man who's been building a new case against me for 7 years. Grace. Ethan's voice cracked on her name. Tell me he's wrong. Grace looked at the man she loved, the man whose trust she was about to shatter, and felt her heart breaking. I can't. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ethan's face crumpled, and Grace saw every emotion flash across his features. Betrayal, hurt, rage, and underneath it all, a grief so profound it made her want to reach for him. So it's true, he said flatly. All of it. The marriage, the work we've been doing together, everything we've built. It was all just part of your plan to destroy my father. No, Grace said desperately, stepping toward him. Ethan, please, let me explain. Explain what? Ethan's voice rose, pain turning to anger. Explain how you've been lying to me for 6 months. Explain how you made me fall in love with you while you were plotting to destroy my family. It wasn't like that. Yes, I came here for revenge initially, but that changed. You changed me. What we have together is real. Real. Ethan laughed bitterly. How can any of this be real when it's all built on lies? Howard watched the exchange with cold satisfaction. You see, son? This is what happens when you trust the wrong people, when you let sentiment cloud your judgment. Shut up, Ethan snapped, turning on his father with sudden fury. Just shut up, you murdered innocent people. You destroyed a family, and you brought their daughter into our house as what? Some kind of sick joke. I brought her here to teach you a lesson about value and character. Ironic, isn't it? She certainly taught you something about both. Grace felt the situation spiraling out of control. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built with Ethan, was crumbling before her eyes. Ethan, please, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, I came here originally for revenge. Yes, Derek orchestrated my selection. But I fell in love with you. That part was never fake. How am I supposed to believe anything you say? Ethan's eyes were bright with unshed tears. How am I supposed to trust someone who's been living a lie for 6 months? Because you know me, Grace said desperately. The woman who helped you through your panic attack, who taught you to drive a truck, who built a business with you. That's who I really am. The rest was just circumstances. Circumstances. Ethan's voice rose again. You call plotting to destroy my family circumstances. I call seeking justice for my murdered parents circumstances. Grace shot back, her own anger finally surfacing. Your father killed them. Ethan, he stole their lives, their future, their chance to see their children grow up. Was I supposed to just forget about that? So you married me to get revenge. I married you to save my brother's life and to get close enough to your father to gather evidence of his crimes. But I fell in love with you anyway. Grace's voice broke on the words. I didn't plan that. I didn't want it, but it happened. Howard stepped between them, his voice cutting through their argument like a blade. Enough of this melodrama. The question now is what we do about this situation. Both Grace and Ethan turned to look at him, and Grace felt a chill run down her spine at the cold calculation in Howard's eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean, my dear daughter-in-law, that you've just confessed to conspiracy, industrial espionage, and fraud. I have witnesses, I have evidence, and I have enough political connections to ensure that you spend the next 20 years in federal prison." Grace's blood turned to ice. "You can't. I can do whatever I want. The question is whether I should destroy you completely or simply neutralize the threat you represent." "What kind of threat could I possibly represent now?" Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind that comes from spending 6 months in my house, observing my business practices, accessing my personal files. The kind that Derek Sullivan has been waiting for." Ethan, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "What files?" Grace closed her eyes, knowing this was the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. "Your father keeps records of all his unofficial business dealings, financial records, correspondence, evidence of the murders and other crimes. I've been documenting everything. You've been spying on us," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "I've been gathering evidence of criminal activity," Grace corrected. "Evidence that could put your father in prison where he belongs. Evidence that could destroy thousands of jobs and ruin countless families who depend on Lancaster transportation," Howard added smoothly. "Is your personal revenge really worth that much collateral damage?" Grace felt the familiar trap closing around her. Howard was a master manipulator, and even now, facing exposure for his crimes, he was trying to make her feel guilty for seeking justice. "Those jobs and families matter," Grace said slowly. "But so did my parents. So does the truth." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, and Grace saw something change in his expression. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but underneath them, she caught a glimpse of something else. Understanding. "Grace," he said quietly, "do you really have evidence that could convict him?" Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. "Enough evidence to prove he killed your parents?" "Yes." Ethan turned to look at his father, and Grace saw decades of manipulation and control being reevaluated in the span of seconds. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did you order the deaths of Richard and Margaret Walker?" Howard's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold predator underneath. "I did what was necessary to protect our family." The admission hung in the air like a gunshot. Ethan closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, Grace saw a man who had just watched his entire world collapse. "Get out," Ethan said quietly. "Son, get out," Ethan roared, his composure finally breaking. "Get out of this house. Get out of my sight. Get out of my life." Howard's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. Ethan, she's using you. This whole thing is manipulation." "Maybe it is," Ethan said, his voice deadly calm. "But at least she's not a murderer." After Howard left, slamming the door behind him hard enough to shake the house, Ethan and Grace stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of their marriage and their carefully constructed new life. "So what happens now?" Grace asked softly. Ethan was quiet for a long time, staring at the photographs his father had left scattered across the counter. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Now I think we need to call Derek Sullivan." Derek Sullivan arrived at the Lancaster mansion within an hour of Grace's call. He looked different now, older, more weathered, but his eyes burned with the same intensity Grace remembered from their clandestine meetings over the past months. As he walked into the study where Grace and Ethan waited, he carried a leather briefcase that seemed to hold the weight of 7 years' worth of carefully gathered evidence. "I have to admit," Derek said, settling into one of the leather chairs, "this isn't how I expected this conversation to happen." Ethan sat rigidly across from him, his jaw clenched tight. The revelation that his wife had been working with this man, that his entire marriage had been orchestrated as part of an elaborate revenge plot, was still too fresh, too raw. But underneath the hurt and anger, Grace could see something else, a growing determination that looked remarkably like his father's, but pointed in the opposite direction. "Show me everything," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from his body. I want to see exactly what my father has done. Derek opened his briefcase and began laying out documents on the coffee table, financial records, correspondence, photographs, witness statements. 7 years of meticulous investigation into Howard Lancaster's criminal empire. Your father is very careful, Derek explained as he organized the papers. He uses shell companies, offshore accounts, intermediaries, but money leaves a trail, and so does murder. Grace watched Ethan's face as Derek walked him through the evidence. Each document was another blow, another crack in the foundation of everything Ethan had believed about his family. She wanted to reach for him, to offer comfort, but the gulf between them felt unbridgeable. These bank records, Ethan said, picking up a stack of statements. They show payments to Marcus Webb's company, but the amounts are way beyond what private investigation services typically cost. Because Webb wasn't just investigating people, Derek replied. He was eliminating problems. Your father's problems. How many people? Ethan's voice was barely audible. That we can prove. 3. Richard and Margaret Walker, and a whistleblower named James Chen, who worked in your father's accounting department. Chen was asking questions about the same government contracts that Richard was investigating. Grace had known about her parents, of course, but hearing about additional victims made her stomach churn. How many lives had Howard destroyed in his pursuit of power and profit? There's more, Derek continued, pulling out a folder marked with red tabs. Bribery, fraud, bid rigging, tax evasion. Your father has turned Lancaster Transportation into a criminal organization masquerading as a legitimate business. Ethan stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured grounds. How long have you known about Grace's connection to all this? Since before she agreed to the marriage, Derek admitted. I've been watching Howard for years, waiting for an opportunity like this. When he decided to force you into marriage as some kind of lesson, I saw a chance to get someone inside his operation. So you manipulated her into it. I presented her with an opportunity for justice, Derek corrected. The choice was always hers. Ethan turned back to face them, his expression unreadable. And what was the plan? Gather evidence and then what? Turn it over to the FBI and hope they could make something stick. Actually, Derek said, reaching for another folder, we have something better than hope. We have Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez. She's been building a RICO case against your father for 18 months, but she needed inside evidence to make it airtight. Grace leaned forward. RICO. Racketeering. If we can prove your father has been running Lancaster Transportation as a criminal enterprise, we can seize all of his assets, not just send him to prison, and destroy thousands of jobs in the process, Ethan said quietly. Derek's expression softened slightly. Not necessarily. The legitimate parts of the business could be sold, restructured. The employees aren't responsible for your father's crimes. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd learned. Grace watched him struggle with the impossible choice between family loyalty and justice, between protecting his father and doing what was right. Grace, Ethan said finally, not looking at her. If you do this, if you turn over all this evidence, what happens to us? The question hung in the air like a prayer. Grace felt her heart breaking all over again. I don't know, but you're going to do it anyway. I have to. For my parents, for the other victims, for everyone your father might hurt in the future. Ethan nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. Then I want to help. Derek blinked in surprise. I'm sorry. What? I want to help bring down my father, Ethan said, his voice growing stronger. I have access to files, meetings, conversations that you don't. If we're going to do this, let's do it right. Ethan, Grace said softly. You don't have to. Yes, I do. He finally looked at her, and she saw pain there, but also resolve. You were right to seek justice for your parents. I was just too blind to see what my father really was. Over the next 3 hours, they planned Howard's downfall with military precision. Ethan would continue his normal routine while wearing a recording device provided by the U.S. Attorney's office. He would attend board meetings, family dinners, any gathering where Howard might incriminate himself further. We need him to either confess to the murders again or discuss ongoing criminal activity, Derek explained. Something that establishes an active conspiracy. The quarterly board meeting is next week. Ethan said. All the major players will be there. If Howard is planning anything new, that's when it would come up. Perfect. We'll have federal agents positioned around the building, once we have enough recorded evidence. They'll move in. As Derek packed up his files and prepared to leave, Grace found herself alone with Ethan for the first time since the confrontation in the kitchen. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," Grace said finally. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know. Sorry for lying to me, or sorry for falling in love with me while you were lying to me." Grace flinched at the bitterness in his voice. "Both. Neither. I don't know, Ethan. I never planned for any of this to get so complicated." Complicated. Ethan's laugh was hollow. That's one word for it. What we built together. The business. The partnership. The way we learned to trust each other. That was real. Whatever else was happening. That was real. Was it? Or was that just part of the plan too? Grace felt tears threatening. "You know it was real. You felt it too. I thought I did. But how can I trust my own feelings when everything they were based on was a lie?" Before Grace could respond, Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his expression hardened. "It's my father. He wants to meet for dinner tomorrow night. Says we need to discuss recent developments." "That could be our opportunity," Grace said. "If you're wearing a wire?" "I know." Ethan pocketed his phone and headed for the door. "I just hope I can pull this off without him suspecting anything." "Where are you going?" "To call Sarah Martinez. If we're going to destroy my father, I want to make sure we do it right." As Ethan left the study, Grace remained alone with the weight of everything that had happened, in trying to save her brother and avenge her parents. She had found love, lost it, and now was preparing to risk everything for justice. The next 24 hours would determine whether Howard Lancaster's empire would finally crumble, and whether there was any chance of salvaging something real from the wreckage of her marriage to his son. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, as if the sky itself was preparing for the reckoning to come. 1 year later, Grace stood at the window of their new office, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The building wasn't much to look at, a converted warehouse in an industrial district outside Richmond, but it represented something she'd never thought possible. A fresh start built on truth instead of deception. Lancaster Walker Logistics read the modest sign by the front door, a name that had taken months of careful negotiation to agree upon. Ethan had insisted on keeping both their names, despite Grace's protests that she didn't deserve equal billing. "We built this together," he'd said during one of their many difficult conversations as they'd worked through the aftermath of Howard's arrest. "Whatever else happened, we built this together." The sound of footsteps on the metal stairs leading to their second-floor office interrupted her thoughts. Ethan appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the work clothes that had become his uniform. Jeans, flannel shirt, steel-toed boots. He looked nothing like the man she'd married 18 months ago, and everything like the man she'd fallen in love with. "Thought you might need caffeine," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Thomas called. He's excited about the field trip to the Transportation Museum." Grace smiled. Accepting the coffee gratefully, Thomas, now 14 and fully recovered from his surgery, had developed a fascination with logistics and supply chain management. He spent his summers working in their warehouse, learning the business from the ground up. "He wants to be just like his sister," Ethan continued, settling into the chair behind his desk. "Building an empire one honest load at a time." Their empire wasn't much yet. 12 independent contractors, 4 company trucks, and a growing reputation for reliability in the mid-Atlantic region. But it was theirs, built without blood money or criminal enterprises, funded by the settlement Grace had received when the government seized Howard's assets. "The Johnson account called," Grace said, checking her notes. "They want to expand our contract to include their West Coast distribution. That's huge. We'd need to hire at least 6 more drivers." "I know, and we'd have to be careful not to grow faster than we can manage quality." It was a conversation they'd had dozens of times over the past year. The balance between ambition and responsibility, between seizing opportunities and maintaining the ethical standards that defined their company. The phone rang. Interrupting their morning planning session, Grace answered, her voice professional and warm. "Lancaster Walker Logistics. This is Grace." "Mrs. Lancaster? This is Officer Jenkins from Richmond Correctional?" "You have a visitor request from inmate Howard Lancaster." Grace's hand tightened on the phone. It had been 6 months since Howard's last attempt to contact her. 6 months since she'd declined his request for a visit. She glanced at Ethan, who had gone very still at his desk. "I'll need to think about it," Grace said finally. "Can I call you back?" After she hung up, Ethan leaned back in his chair and studied her face. "You don't have to see him. I know. But you're considering it." Grace was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Sometimes I think about the things he said that last night, about collateral damage, about the families that depended on Lancaster transportation, all those people who lost their jobs when the company was dismantled. Those people found other jobs," Ethan said firmly. "And the ones who didn't, we've hired as many as we could. What happened to them isn't your fault, isn't it? If you hadn't pursued this, my father would still be out there, still be killing people who got in his way. How many more Richard and Margaret Walkers would there have been?" Grace nodded, knowing he was right, but still struggling with the weight of unintended consequences. The government's RICO case had been devastating and thorough. Howard was serving 25 years in federal prison. Marcus Webb and 2 other associates had received similar sentences. The legitimate parts of Lancaster transportation had been sold off piece by piece, the proceeds going to victim compensation and government coffers. "There's something else," Grace said, setting down her coffee cup. "Derek called yesterday. Howard's been talking to federal investigators. Apparently, he wants to provide information about other cases in exchange for a reduced sentence." Ethan's expression darkened. "Let me guess. He's suddenly developed a conscience. More like he's developed a fear of spending the rest of his life in prison." Grace walked back to the window, looking out at the busy warehouse below where their employees were preparing for another day of honest work. "The investigators want to know if we'd be willing to testify if any of his information leads to new prosecutions." "And what did you tell Derek?" "That I'd discuss it with my husband." The word still felt strange on her tongue. Even after 8 months of marriage. Their real marriage. The one they'd chosen instead of the one that had been forced on them. The ceremony had been small, held in the hospital chapel where Thomas had recovered from his surgery. Grace had worn a simple blue dress. Ethan had cried during his vows. There had been no business arrangements, no contracts, no ulterior motives. Just 2 people who had found love in the ruins of their broken world. "Do you want to testify?" Ethan asked gently. "I want justice, but I also want to move forward with our life." Grace turned to face him. "What do you think we should do?" Ethan stood and walked over to her, taking her hands in his. Even after all this time, his touch still sent warmth through her chest. "I think," he said slowly, "that we do whatever helps the most people. If Howard's information can put other criminals in prison, if it can prevent other families from going through what yours did, then we help. But we do it on our terms, and we don't let it consume our lives." Grace leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Ethan replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "She taught me that the most important thing isn't what happens to you, but how you choose to respond to it." A knock on the office door interrupted them. Maria, their office manager and former Lancaster Mansion housekeeper, stuck her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. Says it's about a job." Grace and Ethan exchanged glances. They weren't currently hiring, but they always made time to talk to potential contractors. "Send them up," Ethan said. A few minutes later, a young woman in her early 20s climbed the stairs to their office. She was nervous but determined, clutching a folder of what looked like driving records and references. "Mr. and Mrs. Lancaster, I'm Jessica Chen. I just got my CDL, and I heard you might have opportunities for new drivers." Grace felt her breath catch. Chen, the same last name as James. Chen, the whistleblower Howard had ordered killed along with her parents. "Are you related to James Chen?" Grace asked gently. Jessica's composure wavered slightly. "He was my father. He died 7 years ago." Grace and Ethan exchanged a meaningful look. This young woman, like Grace herself, was trying to build a life from the ashes of her father's murder. "Tell us about your experience," Ethan said, gesturing for Jessica to take a seat. As Jessica began talking about her training, her goals, her determination to honor her father's memory through honest work, Grace felt something settle in her chest. This was why they'd built Lancaster Walker Logistics. Not just for themselves, but for people like Jessica, for Thomas, for everyone who deserved a chance to succeed through merit rather than manipulation. Later that afternoon, after they'd hired Jessica as their newest driver and helped her complete the paperwork, Grace and Ethan stood together in their warehouse, watching their team prepare the day's deliveries. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Giving up your inheritance? Walking away from all that wealth and power?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I regret the pain it caused. I regret that it took so long for me to see who my father really was. But walking away from that life, no, I don't regret that for a second. Even though we're starting over with nothing, we're not starting with nothing," Ethan corrected, slipping his arm around her waist. "We're starting with something much more valuable than money, which is each other, trust, a clean conscience, the knowledge that everything we build from here is ours because we earned it." Grace leaned against him, watching Thomas help one of their drivers secure a load. Her brother had grown 3 inches in the past year and was already talking about studying business and logistics in college. He wanted to expand their operation internationally, bring their ethical approach to global shipping. "There's one more thing," Grace said, pulling a letter from her jacket pocket. "This came in the mail today." Ethan took the envelope, his eyebrows rising when he saw the return address. "Richmond Correctional Facility. It's from your father," Grace explained. "I haven't opened it yet." Ethan held the letter for a long moment, then walked over to the industrial shredder they used for confidential documents. Without ceremony, he fed the letter into the machine. "Some chapters need to stay closed," he said simply. That evening, they drove home to the modest house they'd bought in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing like the Lancaster mansion, but filled with warmth and laughter. Grace was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Ethan appeared behind her, his arms circling her waist. "I have news," he said, his voice carrying a note of barely contained excitement. "Good news. The best," Dr. Martinez called while you were in the shower. Grace turned in his arms, searching his face, and, "Congratulations, Mrs. Lancaster. We're going to have a baby." The words hit Grace like a physical force, joy and terror and overwhelming love washing over her in waves. She and Ethan had been trying for months, hoping to start the family they'd both dreamed of. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Blood test confirmed it. Due date is sometime in early spring." Grace threw her arms around his neck, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe it. After everything we've been through, our child is going to grow up knowing the difference between real wealth and money," Ethan said, his own eyes bright with tears. "They're going to learn that the most valuable thing you can leave your children isn't an inheritance, it's integrity," as they held each other in their small kitchen. Surrounded by the life they'd built from love and loss and second chances, Grace thought about the journey that had brought them here. She'd started with revenge and found justice. She'd sought money and found love. She'd planned to destroy a family and ended up creating one. The pure love had indeed been born from the cruelest plan, just as Howard had unknowingly prophesied. But what he'd never understood was that love, once born, could transform everything it touched, even the darkest intentions into the brightest hope. Outside their window, the sun was setting on another day in their new life, and tomorrow would bring fresh challenges and opportunities. But Grace no longer feared the future. She had learned that the strongest foundations were built not on wealth or power, but on truth, trust, and the unshakable belief that love could conquer anything, even the shadows of the past.